It is way harder to be an IEM reviewer than you might think. About a year or two ago, I wanted to upgrade my headphones. A little bit about me. I've been a music producer for about 15 years, and my whole life I've been around different audiophile gear. My dad was a huge audiophile, listening to all different genres and all different formats, vinyl, CDs, electrostatic speakers, planars, dynamic driver ones. Like, I could hear the difference in audiophile gear, but it wasn't until I learned a lot of production skills like compression, saturation, transient response, and that kind of stuff where I could start to hear the difference. Anyways, always been kind of a casual audiophile, having phases where I'll listen to a nice audiophile record on a good system. But for the most part, what has always mattered the most to me is just the music and training my ears to get used to one set of speakers or headphones so that it's just way more easy as a producer to like produce on them. So I find these Audio-Technica M50s really comfortable. So I decided to just kind of like learn how they sound, learn their strengths and weaknesses, and learn to produce on them. But a couple years ago, I had to stop producing as much as I'd like. I've got some sort of weird muscle issue going on. I can't use the computer very much, hurts my hands, but I still like audio. And so I was like, hey, maybe I could get into reviewing different audio products even just for fun. So did a bunch of research, and the first thing I bought was the Dan Clark E3 closed bag planar magnetic headphone, which, if you've seen any reviews on it, is probably one of the most consistently positively reviewed headphones. I know it's not an IEM, but just stick with me here. And I'm not going to lie, my expectations were really high just because everyone gave it such a high rating, one of the best closed backs they've ever heard, especially for planars and blah, blah, blah. And I got it, and I was not a fan for a couple reasons. Turns out I personally don't get a good seal with it, with my glasses and my head shape and everything. It took me the longest time to realize my opinions on it were give or take the same as other reviewers. If I held it in a specific spot and pushed it in, then I was like, oh wow, you know what? This actually isn't that bad. It's pretty good. But it was also really heavy and uncomfortable for me because, like I said, I've got muscle issues. And so I went from that, and then the next thing I bought were two things at once. I got the Truth Ear Reds, which is like a $50 IEM, and I bought those at the same time as the Moondrop Variations, which is like a $500 at that time, at least. Maybe they're cheaper now, IEM. And the Truth Ear Red arrived first, and I immediately was kind of blown away. Compared to the $2,000 Canadian or $3,000 Canadian possibly that I spent on the Dan Clarks, the $50 or so on the Truth Ear Reds, it just blew me away. I was way more satisfied with the product. I liked the design way more. It was way more comfortable. It's an IEM, dual dynamic driver, so it's really easy to drive. So I could just plug it into anything and it would sound give or take how it should. And I just thought it was great. And to be honest, I should have just stopped there because I was just blown away and my expectations were so low, and it surpassed them so much that I just kind of fell in love with them. Then about a week later, the Moondrop Variations show up. And when I first stick them in, kind of a reverse happened, right? I'm like, man, if this is how good a $50 IEM sounds, how good is a $500 one going to sound? And the Dan Clark thing kind of happened a little bit, except I had still a way better experience. Again, my expectations were just too high, and I was like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have gotten these. And then when I went back to the Truth Ear Reds, I was like, oh, okay, the Moondrop Variations sound way better. But again, it was that expectation and just where my brain was at perception-wise. Bringing this all back into reviewing an IEM, it gets hard because you're kind of always comparing to what you last heard and what you think you last heard. So say if you had a nice listening sesh before bed and it was like 2 a.m. and you were tired, and then you get up and you drink coffee, which changes your hearing a little bit, believe it or not, makes your ears ring a little bit more. I find when I've had a lot of caffeine or I'm fatigued, I like a lot less bass, as the more bass, it uses your eardrum more, it moves it more or something. I don't know what that is. And it's just more fatiguing. So my preference changes quite constantly. But anyways, yeah. So anyways, hopefully that makes sense, but I want to just move into some points that make it really hard to be an IEM reviewer and some things to consider if you want to be a reviewer yourself, or if you just watch a lot of reviewers, and just some things to keep in mind when viewing their opinions and stuff. So the number one thing I want to talk about is how you could do a blind test on the same IEM and have a slightly different opinion all the time because of the reasons I just mentioned, like the caffeine, how fatigued you were, what you had previously listened to, and also just the seal, right? Every time you put it in, you're going to plunge it in a slightly different direction, and you are going to get a slightly different sound. So there's that. Another thing that I don't see talked about a whole lot is just how different IEMs, even more so than headphones and speakers, sound vastly different at different volumes. So for example, those truthier reds I was talking about, at low volumes, I actually like them quite a bit. There's a little spot where they're a little shrill, but me being a picky snob, I just use EQ and dip that down, and it's fine. They're actually really good. Yeah. At high volumes, I find them to be not my favorite, which is just fine. So if I'm kind of fatigued and want to have a low, quiet listening sesh, I'll use the truthier red. If I want to kind of blast my ears, have the highest resolution that I have for an IEM personally right now is the Moondrop Variation still. Yeah, I'll put those in. And then because of the electrostatic tweeter, I can actually hear everything that's in there more so. Not that you're missing out much on the truthier red, but an example I'll probably talk about a lot on this channel is there's a song by Jisoo, the Blackpink member, Flower, I think the song is. And in the intro, there's this really, really high frequency ping. And on a lot of headphones, speakers, and IEMs, you can't hear it at all. And you don't realize how much high end you're missing until you hear something that does play it back. And so, yeah. So back to the points where being an IEM reviewer might be harder than you think. Every time you put it in your ear, the same ear set, the same IEM can sound slightly different. Just a slightly different direction you plunged it into your ear, the depth of how much you plunged it, if you changed ear tips, even if you used the same ear tips but you took them off, put them back on, you'll notice that it's not like clicking a headphone jack into place where it's like the same click for sure spot. So that can change the environment you're in, the position you're in, how much caffeine you've had, Tylenol, aspirin, that kind of thing. I forget which one was mentioned, but I just watched Axel Grell, the creator of a lot of the best Sennheiser headphones, talk about how sometimes they would use, it was either Tylenol or aspirin for critical listening sessions because it gives you more oxygen in your ear or something like that. That was on the Headphone Show podcast. You should go check it out if you haven't. It's really interesting. But yeah, fatigue, all that kind of stuff can change the way you hear things. Another thing that's kind of a nitpick, but as someone who has slight mobility issues in my hands, I got to bring this up because I've never seen anybody talk about it. Changing ear tips can be surprisingly frustrating and hard on a lot of IEMs. So hear me out. The nozzle will be freaking huge and the ear tip will just be like a standard size. And I've watched videos on the proper way to do it. And I can't do it as often as I'd like to as a reviewer with my bad hands. But I'm convinced it's probably really tricky even for fully healthy, functional humans because it is really hard. And so sometimes I have to like take the rubber earpiece and just kind of gently stretch it out a little bit. Not to the point where I'm breaking it or whatever, but that can be really frustrating. Yeah, so I want to give a shout out to, again, I don't know why I'm talking about them so much, but the truthier reds, because sure, they have a big nozzle, but a lot of the ear tips they include actually have an appropriately sized hole, so you can actually just put them on. Like when I was a kid, I would put different ear tips on. Well, I was a kid, so I didn't know any better. I was buying skull candies and just ones that I thought looked cool, and I never had an issue putting the ear tips on. I never did. You would just like plunge them on, and they would go on. And AirPods Pro, another plunger one, you just stick it on. It just goes on. So shout out to Apple for doing that. But yeah, a lot of the higher end IEMs, they are tricky to put those darn rubber ear tips on. It's a small thing, but it does add up. Another thing that makes it tricky to review things is listening volume. So if you're going to be reviewing a lot of headphones, chances are your ears might get fatigued over time. And at low volumes, bass and treble often are reduced. I believe it's because of the Fletcher-Munson curve. But yeah, also not just that, but some IEMs sound quite a bit better even if they don't lose bass and treble, like I just said, which might sound a bit hypocritical, but they just sound better at low volumes, medium volumes, high volumes. So again, to talk about the truthier red, I think it sounds quite nice for the price at a low volume. I think the resolution, imaging, everything is pretty good, but at a medium to high volume, it can sound a bit more shrill than at low volumes. So that's another thing to consider. Source gear matters a lot. I know a lot of reviewers talk about how IEMs are easier to drive than headphones and stuff, and so you don't need to plug them into anything special. But I don't know if it's just me, but I've found that low ohm or like low impedance, whatever the term is, headphones and IEMs are almost more susceptible to source changes. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but like, for example, these Audio-Technicas that I have here, if I stick them into a tube amp, for example, I feel like I notice a much bigger difference than if I plug in, say, the HD650s into different things, even though I believe the impedance on these is 300 ohms. And so yeah, I will notice to get the most out of the HD650s, I will want something that can drive it properly, but it'll sound the same sound, just driven slightly better, if that makes sense. Whereas on something low ohm like this or an IEM, I notice quite a difference, a bit more of a coloration to the sound. Maybe it's easier to hear the bass if it's driven a lot, or sometimes it can be too much and it can sound a bit compressed. I know on my DAP or my digital audio player that I use, the Hibi R4, sometimes IEMs can sound a bit more compressed, at least to me, on the high gain setting. It has 3 different settings. And so, yeah, again, just depending on the IEM, you got to flip through those. It's just one more variable you got to think about. I've probably already mentioned this. I don't know how much I'm editing out and whatnot, but perception and what I'm going to call brain EQ. So your brain EQ sounds based off of what you're used to, right? So if you're coming from something really V-shaped and extremely treble heavy like the M50s, and then you go to the HD650s, it's like going from this to this. And it might not be actually that bad of a difference, and the HD650 might be a better headphone to some, but when you do that direct thing, it really sounds lacking. It's kind of like if you first see a really overly saturated picture, and then you kind of have it a little bit more color correct, like something that a film person, a color grade specialist, they might want something a little bit more less clipping the colors. But if you're used to something super saturated, that might look flat or dull or whatever. And it's the same thing with audio. So kind of depends on what you last heard and what you're coming from. But yeah, I still want to maybe get into reviewing audio gear, especially headphones. I find for headphones, my opinion seems to be more the same every time I put that headphone on. Whereas the IEMs, man, every time I'm like, okay, this is for sure how I think it sounds. And then a week will go by and I'll go back to it and I'm like, man, it's a little bit different, but I'm getting better at it. And I have spent a lot of money on different IEMs, different prices, and I'm starting to get better at reviewing and having a consistent, reliable thought on what it sounds like, despite all the things I talked about in this video. But yeah, there's just so much to it. And yeah, anyways, I just wanted to ramble about that. I hope to post a bunch of IEM and headphone reviews. Okay, bye.